They didn't just take a few feet of gravel. They took the one thing I'd worked my whole adult life to own outright. And the craziest part is they honestly thought I'd just shrug and live with it, like a man who forgets where his own front door is located. If you've ever had someone smile at you while they were actively robbing you blind, you'll know exactly the specific type of cold fury that settles in your gut, heavy and hard like wet concrete. It wasn't about the asphalt, and it wasn't even really about the property value, though that certainly mattered. It was about the absolute unmitigated gall of thinking you can conquer another man's territory just because your car costs more than his house. I'm a landscaper by trade, which means I understand the earth. I understand dirt. I understand roots. And most importantly, I understand lines. When you spend 30 years laying sod and building retaining walls, you develop a deep, almost spiritual respect for boundaries. A line on a map isn't just ink, it's a promise. It's a difference between order and chaos, between being a neighbor and being an invader. I bought my place 15 years ago. It wasn't a palace, it was a foreclosure, a beat-up ranch style that smelled like mildew and neglect. But the bones were good, and the lot was deep. I spent every weekend for the first 5 years rehabilitating that house, stripping away the rot, putting in new plumbing, and meticulously grading the yard. The driveway was my pride and joy. Not because it was fancy, it was just crushed stone and gravel, but because I had laid it myself. Wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, ensuring the drainage was perfect. It was wide enough for my work truck and my trailer, with exactly 3 feet of clearance on the side before the property line, which was marked by an old oak tree and a buried iron pin I had located with a metal detector the week I moved in. I knew where my land ended. I knew exactly where my dominion stopped and the rest of the world began. Then the Callaways moved in next door. The house next to mine had been empty for a year, a quiet buffer zone that I had grown to appreciate. But then the sold sign went up, and the contractors arrived. For 3 months it was nothing but the sound of power saws and the shouting of foremen as they turned a modest 2-story into a sprawling, modern farmhouse-style monstrosity that looked like it had been ordered out of a catalog for people who hate character. I tried to be neighborly when they finally moved in. I walked over with a 6-pack of decent beer and introduced myself. Richard Calloway answered the door, looking at the beer like I was handing him a dead rat, and gave me a limp handshake that felt like holding a wet fish. His wife, sleek and constantly looking at her phone, didn't even look up. They were the type of people who viewed the neighborhood not as a community, but as a backdrop for their lives. And me, I was just the hired help that happened to live next door. The trouble started small, as it always does with boundary pushers. It began with their guests. They threw parties every Friday, loud affairs with catered food and cars lining the street. One evening I came home late from a job, bone-tired and covered in mulch dust, to find a BMW parked halfway onto my gravel. I had to park my truck on the street and haul my gear in by hand. I let it slide. It happened again a week later. Then, I noticed the landscaping crew they hired, not a local outfit, but some big corporate franchise, had started blowing their leaves onto my side of the line. I went over and spoke to Richard, who was washing his Tesla in the driveway, when I mentioned the parking and the leaves. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that grated on my nerves. He told me I was being uptight, that neighbors share, and that he'd mentioned it to his friends. He didn't apologize. He didn't look me in the eye. He just kept scrubbing a spot on his hood that was already spotless. 2 weeks later I came home to find a construction crew pouring asphalt. My stomach dropped. They weren't just paving their driveway. They were widening it, and they weren't just widening it a little. They had excavated a 10-foot strip of grass my grass and were currently rolling hot, black asphalt over the gravel strip I used for my trailer. I parked my truck in the middle of the street, ignoring the honk of a car behind me, and stormed over. Peter Foreman tried to stop me, waving a clipboard, but I walked right past him to where Richard was standing, supervising the theft of my land with a satisfied smirk on his face. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. He looked at me with that same condescending pithy, like he was explaining calculus to a toddler. He told me he was improving the property value for both of us. He said he'd had a survey done informally by a buddy of his, and it turned out that the property line wasn't where we thought it was. He claimed the old oak tree wasn't the marker, but rather a utility pole 20 feet into my yard. It was reclaiming what was rightfully his, he said, and he was generous enough to pave it so I could have a nice, clean edge. I told him to stop the crew immediately. I told him I had the deed, the plot map, and the iron pins to prove he was dead wrong. He just shrugged and said it was already poured, and if I had a problem, I could take it up with his lawyer, because he wasn't going to tear up wet asphalt. He turned his back on me and walked inside his house. I stood there, watching the steam rise off the blacktop, realizing that he wasn't just stealing land. He was banking on the fact that I was the guy who wouldn't have the money or the time to fight a wealthy man in court. He thought he could bully me with his wallet. He thought I would fold. He was wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the copy of my deed, listening to the silence of the house I had built with my own sweat. I felt a mixture of panic and fury. Panic, because lawyers are expensive and I operate on thin margins. fury, because this was a violation of the most basic social contract. You don't touch another man's home. The next morning I didn't go to work. I went to the county clerk's office. I paid for a certified copy of the official plat map. Then I called a licensed surveyor, a guy I'd worked with on commercial jobs named Old Man Miller. Miller was expensive, and he was grumpy, but he was the best in the state. I told him it was an emergency. He came out 2 days later with his total station and his crew. Richard came out to watch, arms crossed, looking annoyed that we were trespassing on his new driveway. Miller didn't say a word to him. He just set up his tripod, located the benchmarks, and started shooting lines. It took him 3 hours. When he was done, he pulled a can of neon orange spray paint out of his truck. He walked onto the fresh, pristine black asphalt Richard had laid. He walked 10 feet in, past the BMW, past the landscaping lights, right up to where Richard's wife was loading groceries. He sprayed a thick, bright orange line right down the middle of their new packing pad, extending all the way to the street. Then he turned to me and said, loud enough for Richard to hear, "He's encroaching by 12 feet of the street and 8 feet at the garage. He's built on your land, son." The look on Richard's face was worth every penny of Miller's fee. But Richard wasn't done. When I presented him with the official survey and asked him to remove the asphalt, he laughed. He actually laughed. He said possession is 9/10 of the law, that it was a civil matter, and that he'd drag it out in court for years until I went bankrupt. He said it's paved now. It's an improvement. No judge is going to make me tear up a $50,000 driveway over a few feet of dirt. He told me to get off his property. I realized then that diplomacy was dead. He wanted a war. I had a landscaping company. I had heavy machinery. I had access to materials. And most importantly, I had a deed that said that 12-foot strip of asphalt was mine. If it was my land, I could do whatever I wanted with it. The next day I didn't sue him. Not yet. I decided to exercise my property rights. I own a dump truck. It's an old Mack, loud, smelly, and beautiful. I drove to the municipal composting center and bought 10 yards of the freshest, steamiest, most pungent mulch they had. It was the bottom of the pile stuff, fermenting in the summer heat, smelling like a combination of vinegar and cow manure. I drove it home. I backed the truck up, careful to keep my tires exactly on the orange line Miller had painted. I engaged the hydraulics. The bed lifted, and I dumped 5 tons of steaming, reeking mulch directly onto the portion of the asphalt that lay on my property. It formed a perfect, massive barricade right behind his BMW, blocking it in completely. Richard came storming out in his bathrobe, screaming about vandalism. I stood on top of the mulch pile, shovel in hand, and calmly told him I was just doing some landscaping on my property. I'm thinking of a raised bed garden, I said. Mulch needs to settle. He called the police. The officers arrived, looked at the survey markers Miller had left, looked at the deed I showed them, and looked at Richard. The sergeant struggled to hide a smile. He told Richard that since the mulch was on my side of the orange line, there was nothing they could do. It was a civil dispute. "Looks like he's just gardening, sir," the cop said. Richard turned purple. But I wasn't done. The mulch was just the opening salvo. A week later, Richard had hired a crew to shovel the mulch away, tossing it onto my lawn. I documented it all with video. I was trespassing and destruction of property. But instead of fighting him over the mulch, I escalated. At a job site nearby that required a porta potty, I called the rental company and told them I needed a unit delivered to my home address for storage. I asked for the economy model, the one that had seen better days. When the delivery truck arrived, I directed the driver to place the unit right at the edge of the street, squarely on the asphalt, exactly 6 inches inside my property line. It was OSHA compliant. It was legal. And it was the first thing Richard saw when he tried to pull his Tesla out of the garage. He had to drive over the curb and through his own front lawn to get around it. The visual of that bright blue plastic outhouse sitting on his luxury driveway was magnificent. The neighborhood noticed. People slowed down to look. The old lady across the street, Mrs. Higgins, actually gave me a thumbs up from her porch. Richard's reputation as the neighborhood lord was crumbling. He tried to have it towed. The towing company refused to touch it once I showed them the survey. He tried to push it over. I bolted it to the asphalt using heavy-duty lag screws. I was technically modifying my own driveway, after all. The smell of the mulch and the sight of the porta potty broke him, but not in the way I expected. He sued me. He served me with papers claiming harassment, interference with enjoyment of property, and emotional distress. He wanted $100,000 in damages and an injunction to force me to sell him the land. It was exactly what I wanted. He had brought the fight to the arena where facts mattered more than bank accounts. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Alina, who specialized in property disputes. "He has admitted to the encroachment in his own lawsuit," she said. "He just handed us the case." The court date was finally set 3 months later. In those 3, claiming I needed his and hers facilities for my gardening projects. I also stacked pallets of bricks on the line, creating a wall that forced him to park on the street. Richard looked more haggard every day. The arrogance was replaced by a twitchy, angry desperation. In the courtroom, Richard's lawyer tried to paint me as a nightmare neighbor, a petty tyrant who was harassing a nice family. He showed pictures of the mulch and the toilets. He talked about how much money Richard had spent beautifying the neighborhood. Then it was Elena's turn. She didn't make a speech. She simply put the certified survey on the overhead projector. She then put up the survey Richard had used, which turned out to be a photocopy of an old tax map that he had drawn on with a Sharpie. The judge, a stern woman with glasses on the end of her nose, leaned in. She looked at Richard. "Mr. Calloway," she asked, "did you pave over this man's property based on a drawing you made yourself?" Richard stammered. He tried to talk about property values. The judge cut him off. "The law regarding real property is ancient and clear," she said. "You cannot improve what you do not own. This is not a gray area. This is theft." The judgment was swift and brutal. The judge dismissed Richard's lawsuit with prejudice, granted my countersuit for trespass and encroachment. She ordered Richard to remove the asphalt from my land within 30 days and restore the grade to its original condition. She also awarded me legal fees and damages for the months I was unable to use my driveway. But the kicker, the absolute cherry on top, was that she ordered him to pay for a new survey to be recorded with the county, permanently cementing the line I had defended. The walk out of the courthouse was quiet. Richard wouldn't look at me. He got into his Tesla and sped off. I drove my truck home, the engine humming a little sweeter. The restoration began a week later. Richard had to hire a demolition crew, not the cheap guys this time, but a bonded company because the court was watching. I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and watched the jackhammers tear into the asphalt. It was a violent, beautiful sound. They ripped up the blacktop, exposing the earth beneath. They hauled away the debris. They brought in loads of clean-filled dirt. They regraded the slope. It took 3 days of noise and dust, and Richard had to pay for every hour of labor. When they were done, my strip of land was dirt again. I went out the next weekend with my wheelbarrow. I bought a load of fresh, gray gravel, a sharp, angular kind that locks together. I spent the entire Saturday spreading it, raking it smooth, packing it down. I could have hired my crew to do it, but I needed to do it myself. I needed to feel the weight of the stone. I needed to reclaim the ground with my own hands. When I was finished, I walked to the edge of the property, to the iron pin that started it all. I looked over at Richard's driveway. It was now a narrow, awkward strip, barely wide enough for one car, with a jagged edge where the saw had cut the asphalt. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a scar. Richard came out to get his mail while I was leaning on my rake. He looked at me, then looked at the fresh gravel. For a second, I thought he might say something, maybe apologize, maybe threaten me again. But he didn't. He just looked defeated. He grabbed his mail and walked back inside, his head down. I realized then that I hadn't just won a court case. I had taught him a lesson about the world that his money had sheltered him from. You can buy a lot of things, but you can't buy reality. And reality is defined by boundaries. Some people think boundaries are there to be pushed, to be negotiated, to be ignored if you have enough status. But those of us who work the ground know better. Boundaries are what keep us civilized. They are the silent agreement that keeps the peace. And when you break that agreement, when you try to pave over another man's life, you don't just get a new driveway. You get a lesson in geology, law, and the unyielding stubbornness of a man who knows exactly where he stands. I took a deep breath, smelling the fresh dust of the gravel and the faint scent of the mulch I had turned into the soil. It smelled like victory. It smelled like home. I walked back up my driveway, the gravel crunching satisfyingly under my boots, knowing that every single pebble belonged to me. Was I petty? Maybe. Did I enjoy the look on his face when the porta potty arrived? Absolutely. But looking at that clean, straight line of gravel, I knew I'd do it all again. Was I defending what was mine, or did I turn it into something bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. Hit like if you believe boundaries matter and shouldn't be crossed by bullies with checkbooks. Subscribe if you want more real stories about standing your ground against the odds.